There's a sentence you can say to a narcissist exactly once that permanently changes what they can do to you, not because it changes them, but because of what it takes off the table the moment you mean it. And I want to be honest with you from the very beginning of this video. This isn't a magic phrase that fixes a narcissist. Nothing does that. What this does is something better, something more permanent, something that doesn't depend on them changing at all. If you've spent any time loving a narcissist, you already know the exhausting cycle of searching for the right words, the perfect explanation, the ideal boundary, the sentence structured so carefully it might finally make them see, might finally make them stop, might finally produce the accountability you've been waiting years for. I need to tell you clearly before we go any further, that sentence doesn't exist. No combination of words has ever reliably changed a narcissist's behavior, because their behavior was never actually about the words you used. It was about what they could get away with, tested against whatever resistance you offered. But there is something you can say, not to change them, but to change what they have access to. And once you understand the difference between those two things, this entire video will make sense in a way that actually holds up, instead of promising something that quietly falls apart the first time they prove it wrong. Let's start with what actually gives a narcissist their power over you, because it's rarely what people assume. It isn't their charm, their confidence, their ability to dominate a room. Those are just delivery mechanisms. The actual power comes from something much simpler and much more specific. Your hope. Your hope that this time is different. Your hope that the right explanation will finally land. Your hope that if you just communicate clearly enough, patiently enough, kindly enough, the person underneath the behavior will finally show up and stay. That hope is the actual leverage a narcissist has over you, and it's the only leverage that has ever really mattered, because everything else, the love bombing, the guilt trips, the disproportionate reactions to reasonable requests, only works because your hope keeps you in the room long enough for those tactics to land. The sentence that changes everything isn't addressed to their behavior at all. It's addressed to your own hope spoken out loud in front of them as a fact rather than a plea. It sounds something like this. I am no longer going to explain myself to you or wait for you to understand why this hurt me. What you do next is information, not a conversation I need to keep having. Read that again? Slowly. Because the power in it isn't obvious at first glance. This isn't a boundary in the traditional sense, not don't do that again or I need you to change. Those statements, however reasonable, still function as requests, and requests keep the negotiation open. A narcissist experienced in negotiation, and every narcissist is, whether they describe it that way or not, hears a request as an invitation to keep working the angle, keep testing, keep looking for the version of themselves they can perform convincingly enough to keep the door from closing. This sentence isn't a request, it's a statement of fact about what you're no longer going to do, regardless of what they do next. Here's what actually happens, psychologically. The moment you say this and genuinely mean it, not perform it, not use it as leverage in an argument you're still hoping to win, but actually integrate it as true. You remove the specific thing a narcissist has always been able to count on from you. Your continued participation in a process where your understanding of the relationship depends on their explanation, their justification, their eventual willingness to engage honestly with what they've done. Most partners, even after significant harm, keep waiting for that engagement because it feels like the natural, healthy thing a real reckoning should include. A narcissist knows this consciously or not and uses the waiting itself as a tool, stringing out partial explanations, vague acknowledgments, promises of a real conversation that never quite arrives, precisely because as long as you're waiting for it, you're still tethered to needing something only they can provide. The sentence severs that tether, not by demanding anything from them, by simply permanently no longer needing it. This is the part worth sitting with carefully, because it's the actual mechanism behind why this changes what they can do to you, even if it never changes who they are. Every tool in a narcissist's arsenal, the gaslighting, the reframing, the disproportionate anger at reasonable requests, the slow erosion of your confidence in your own perception, depends on you remaining an active participant in a shared narrative they get to help author. The moment you stop needing their version of events in order to trust your own, that entire toolkit loses its primary point of leverage. They can still lie. They can still try to reframe what happened. They can still attempt every manipulation that's worked before. But none of it lands the way it used to, because it was never actually the manipulation itself that had power over you. It was your need for it to eventually resolve into something that made sense, something that came from them, something that finally proved you weren't imagining what you saw. Once that need is gone, genuinely gone, not performed as a negotiating tactic but actually released, you become someone their tools were never built to work on. Here's what makes this so different from every other boundary you've probably tried before, and it's worth understanding clearly because the difference is the entire reason this one actually holds where the others eventually cracked. Most boundaries with a narcissist get stated as conditions. If you do this again, I'll leave. I need you to stop doing that. This behavior isn't acceptable to me. Conditions require enforcement, and enforcement requires you to notice every single time the line gets crossed, weigh whether this particular crossing is significant enough to act on, and then follow through consistently enough that the boundary means something. This is exhausting even under the best circumstances, and a narcissist, whose entire relational skill set is built around finding exactly where lines can be blurred, is remarkably good at finding the specific gray areas that make enforcement feel unreasonable in any single instance, even while the pattern taken as a whole is exactly what the boundary was meant to prevent. The sentence we're talking about doesn't require that kind of ongoing enforcement because it isn't a condition about their behavior. It's a statement about your own internal process. And internal processes don't require you to catch every instance of someone else's misconduct in order to remain true. You don't have to notice every manipulation attempt, weigh its severity, and decide whether this one crosses the line. You've already decided in advance that your understanding of what happened between you no longer depends on their cooperation. That decision doesn't need to be relitigated every time they try something new, because it was never actually about their specific behaviors in the first place. It was about where your own certainty comes from. This is precisely why saying this sentence and meaning it tends to produce such a disorienting reaction in a narcissist, often far more disorienting than an angry confrontation or a list of specific complaints would ever produce. Because anger, however uncomfortable, is still something they know how to work with. It's still engagement. It still gives them material, something to apologize for, deflect from, reframe, use as evidence that you're too sensitive or impossible to please. What they don't know how to work with is calm, final indifference to their explanations, delivered not as punishment but as simple fact. There's nothing to argue against because you haven't made a claim they can dispute. You've simply described what you're no longer going to do, and there's no version of clever reframing that changes a decision you've already made about your own internal process rather than about them. Watch what happens next, because this is where the actual protection becomes visible in practice. A narcissist facing this sentence will almost always test it at least once, usually several times, because their entire relational history has taught them that stated limits are usually softer than they sound in the moment they're spoken. They'll offer an explanation anyway, hoping you'll engage with it. They'll escalate slightly, testing whether pressure produces the reaction absence of pressure didn't. They might even, in some cases, offer something that looks like genuine vulnerability, hoping that will be the exception that finally reopens the door the earlier tools couldn't. None of this needs to be met with an argument, a rebuttal, or even much of a response at all. And this is actually the deepest source of the sentence's power. You already told them what you're not doing anymore. You don't need to keep proving it every time they test it. The test simply fails quietly, because nothing they offer changes the internal process you've already completed. I want to address something important here because it's the piece that makes this genuinely different from simply going cold or shutting down emotionally, which is not what this is about. This isn't about becoming unreachable, unfeeling, or permanently guarded against every person in your life. It's specifically, precisely about this one relationship, this one pattern, this one person who has demonstrated repeatedly that their explanations were never actually building toward genuine accountability. You can still feel deeply, you can still love fully in relationships that have earned that kind of openness through consistent demonstrated trustworthiness. What you're releasing here is something much narrower and much more specific. The belief that this particular person's words are a reliable source of truth about what happened between you, and the practice of waiting for those words before trusting your own perception. This is also worth naming clearly because it matters for how you actually implement this rather than just understanding it intellectually. You don't need to deliver this sentence in a dramatic confrontation, and in most cases you shouldn't. The power isn't in the delivery. It's in the decision underneath it, which can be made quietly, privately, without ever announcing it directly if a direct announcement would put you at risk or simply isn't safe or practical in your specific situation. Some empaths do say a version of this sentence out loud in a final conversation or a text they never expect a reasonable response to. Others simply live it silently, letting their behavior demonstrate the decision rather than narrating it in advance. Both versions work because the actual mechanism, releasing your need for their explanation as the source of your certainty, doesn't depend on them ever hearing the words at all. It depends entirely on whether you've actually made the decision true inside yourself. This is where the real, lasting protection settles in, not in the moment you say the words, but in every moment afterward when the old provocations arrive and simply don't find anything left to grab onto. Because here's what happens to a narcissist over time, once they discover that this particular door doesn't reopen no matter which key they try. They don't stop being who they are. I want to be honest with you about that, because false hope has no place in this story. They will very likely keep doing versions of what they've always done. The reframing, the vague apologies that never sharpen into specifics, the sudden bursts of charm timed suspiciously well, the guilt aimed at exactly the parts of you that used to soften fastest. None of that stops. What stops is its effect on you. This is the actual gift buried inside this entire framework, and it's worth naming plainly. You were never going to get a version of this story where they finally become someone incapable of disrespecting you. That version doesn't exist. And chasing it is what kept so many empaths, maybe including you, stuck in cycles that lasted years longer than they should have. What you can get, and what this sentence actually delivers, is a version of yourself no longer positioned to receive that disrespect as something that requires your response, your explanation seeking, your patient waiting for a reckoning that was never coming. Their behavior can continue exactly as it always has. It simply stops landing anywhere that matters because the place it used to land, your need for their words to make sense of what happened, isn't there to catch it anymore. This is why the sentence works permanently, in a way no boundary tied to their behavior ever could. Boundaries about behavior require them to keep crossing a line for you to notice, and narcissists are skilled enough at blurring lines that enforcement eventually exhausts itself. This isn't about a line they might cross. It's about a need you've released entirely, and a released need doesn't come back just because they find a clever new angle to press against it. You can't be manipulated through a door you've already permanently walked away from needing to open. There's no wrong way to do this, and there's no timeline you're required to follow either. Some people reach this decision after one final betrayal. Others arrive here slowly, after years of smaller disappointments, finally adding up to the same conclusion. What matters isn't how fast you got here or how many times you tried something else first. What matters is that the decision, once made honestly, doesn't need to be perfect to be permanent. You're allowed to still feel the pull sometimes. You're allowed to still hope, quietly, and still hold the boundary anyway. Here's something worth understanding about what happens on their side of this, months and sometimes years down the line, because it explains a pattern a lot of empaths notice but rarely have language for. A narcissist who has genuinely lost access to your need for their explanation doesn't simply give up and move on cleanly, the way a healthier person eventually would. They often keep testing at increasingly wide intervals because some part of their psychology never fully accepts that a door is permanently closed until every possible key has been tried and failed. You might get a message 8 months later, a year later, sometimes longer, not because they've been thinking about you constantly, but because their system periodically checks whether the conditions have changed, whether enough time has passed, whether a new approach might succeed where the old ones didn't, whether the version of you that released this need has perhaps quietly reverted back to needing it after all. This is worth knowing in advance because it means you shouldn't interpret a late, unexpected message as evidence that anything about your original decision was wrong. It's simply the predictable behavior of someone whose relational toolkit has never included genuinely accepting a permanent no. The message isn't information about you, it's information about them and about how long a psychological structure like theirs takes to fully stop testing a boundary that's actually held. I want to address something that might be sitting underneath all of this for you because it's important and rarely spoken about directly. Releasing the need for their explanation doesn't mean you'll never feel angry again or never feel the old ache of wanting acknowledgement for what you went through. Those feelings can coexist with the boundary holding firm. In fact, they usually do for a long time. The goal was never to arrive at some permanent, untouchable calm where nothing about the relationship affects you anymore. That's not how healing actually works, and expecting it of yourself will only add another layer of unfair pressure onto something that's already hard enough. The goal is much narrower and much more achievable. That your peace, your daily functioning, your sense of what's true about what happened to you no longer depends on anything they say, do, or eventually admit. The feelings can still visit, they just don't get to make decisions for you anymore. This is also where it's worth saying something clearly about what this sentence is not. It is not a weapon designed to make them suffer, and using it as one, waiting for the perfect, most devastating moment to deliver it, hoping to watch it land like a blow, actually undermines its power because it keeps you oriented toward their reaction as the measure of whether it worked. It didn't work because they reacted a certain way. It worked the moment you meant it, regardless of whether they ever knew you'd said it at all, regardless of whether their face changed, regardless of whether they came back 6 times afterward pretending nothing had shifted. The measure of success was never their response. It was your own release, complete and quiet, whether or not anyone else ever witnessed it happening. If you're standing at the edge of saying something like this yourself, tired of waiting for an explanation that keeps almost arriving and never quite does, tired of the exhausting work of trying to find the exact words that will finally make them understand, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't need their understanding in order to be certain about what happened to you. You already know. You lived it. Every instinct that told you something was wrong was accurate long before you had the language to explain why, and that accuracy doesn't require their confirmation to remain true. Say the sentence, out loud, or only to yourself, and mean it completely. I am no longer going to explain myself to you or wait for you to understand why this hurt me. What you do next is information, not a conversation I need to keep having. They may test it. They may escalate, retreat, circle back with something that looks briefly like remorse. They may wait a year and try again. Certain enough time has passed that this time might be different. None of it requires anything from you anymore because you already gave this relationship the only thing that was ever actually keeping it running, your hope that the explanation was still coming. That hope is yours to keep or release. And the moment you release it, permanently, quietly, on your own terms, you become someone they can no longer touch in the one place they always used to reach you. Not because they changed, because you finally stopped needing them to. And that difference, small enough to fit inside a single sentence, large enough to end a cycle that once felt like it would never break, was always, this entire time, something only you could give yourself. No apology was ever going to hand it to you. No explanation, however honest, could have delivered it faster or more completely than the moment you simply decided you no longer required one. That decision was always yours to make. It still is.